Hello friends, tonight we're taking a look at the Glock Performance Trigger. Many of you have asked me about this thing, and only now do I feel like I actually have enough experience with it to make a sort of a decent preliminary review. And hey, a warning up front, if you can't take a joke, you're going to want to avoid this one. So there are a billion aftermarket triggers for the Glock, some of which are extravagantly expensive, and they even come in bright and shiny colors so that you can let everyone at the range know that you're the sort of person who can't shoot for shit with a standard trigger. Now, every time I make any kind of Glock video, it doesn't matter what it's about, there's at least one guy who writes a short treatise in the comment section about why he hates Glock because the trigger is ass and they're overrated. The usual stuff. Well, Glock has made a trigger for you so that you can finally shut the fuck up. Even though now you're just going to complain that you have to spend extra money to make the gun what it should have been out of the box. The gun community reflects society as a whole, where vapid, barely sentient people group themselves into different ideologies based on the consumer goods that they spend their money on. They use these objects to completely define themselves and perhaps construct some semblance of a personality where none existed prior. One group worships the Glock. Glock is the best and is defined wholly by the ownership of the Glock. Another loathes the Glock. A third group says revolvers are best and plastic is for storing food in your fridge. I hate change. Change is bad and I will not do it. It's like when someone starts talking politics and before the first sentence is complete, you know all of the other opinions they're going to express. That shit is embarrassing. So Glocks aren't my favorite guns of all time, but they do what they do very well. And the trigger, the stock trigger, is part of that. As more companies move to fully pre-cocked strikers, I like that Glock stuck with the partially cocked striker. But now, with the performance trigger, you can convert your Glock to a fully cocked striker to stop your endless complaining. Your delicate little fingies can rejoice. The trigger is a factory drop-in trigger, so it's made by Glock. It's an OEM part, and with that should come the reliability and safety that we expect from Glock while giving you a far better trigger pull. The performance trigger is light with a great reset, and Glock says that it leaves all of the Glock safeties in place, unlike some of the aftermarket triggers that some companies sell for these guns. Well, is that true? We'll take a close look inside and talk about exactly how it works. This next part, I've had to do like 5 takes because I just cannot say this next fucking sentence for some reason. Up front, I should note 2 things. This trigger changes the way a Glock works. You may like that, or it may bother you. This trigger kit improves the feel by converting the Glock to a pre-cocked striker rather than the traditional partially cocked striker that is a huge part of the Glock design and how they feel. This doesn't bother me, as pre-cocked strikers are a proven technology at this point. I love the PPQ, I love the VP9, those are fantastic guns. Second, I need to note my own bias. I'm not bothered by the stock Glock trigger, and I view these improved triggers, this one and the ones made by third-party companies, as perhaps unnecessary. You know, unless you just want something fun for the range, or you just, I don't know, feel like feeling a different feeling with your little finger there, I guess. The standard Glock trigger serves a purpose, and I like that purpose. If I want a different trigger feel, which I often do, there are other guns that do that better. I'll explain in detail why I feel this way when we look at performance, but I've never disliked the stock Glock trigger. You know, if I want to shoot a PPQ, I've got one. I love the PPQ. I'll just shoot that instead. In fact, I find the standard Glock trigger very comforting and enjoyable to use. I also shoot it pretty well, you know, as far as my meager shooting skills will let me shoot it well. But with my personal bias out of the way, more options are always good, and I'm very glad that Glock released this kit. It feels fantastic. Though I joke about aftermarket Glock triggers, more options are always good for consumers, and I'm glad that we have so many to choose from. Features. The Glock Performance Trigger is a drop-in trigger kit that converts your Glock to a fully cocked striker. It reduces the pull weight to somewhere around 3 to 3.5 pounds. The variance is from, just the inevitable variability of factory tolerances. Manufacturing is not an exact science, as much as we would like it to be. The trigger shoe has a wider, flatter face with a version of the standard Glock safety. The dingus may just be the standard one, I can't tell. So let's take a moment to talk about what all this means. With a normal Glock trigger system, when the gun cycles, the striker is only partially cocked. Meaning that this tab there is not pulled all the way to the rear. That's attached to the striker. And so what happens is when you pull the trigger, that is pushing the striker to the rear, and then when it drops down, that releases the striker, it slams forward and sets off the round. And with a standard Glock trigger, you can feel all of this at work. The gun cycles, the striker is only partially cocked. You pull the trigger, you are pulling the striker the rest of the way to the rear until the sort of sear-ish part of the trigger bar drops down at an angle and releases the striker, firing the gun. You can feel all that. There's this section of take up. Then there may or may not be a wall depending on what generation your Glock is and how much it's been used. This take up is part of the Glock's safety system. The idea being that the trigger pull is longer than a traditional single action pull while still being relatively light and consistent each time. Well, does it work? I guess it depends on your taste, training, and preferences. But hey, that's why we have other guns and other options. With a pre-cock trigger, when the gun cycles, the striker is held at its rearward position. Then when you pull the trigger, you're just releasing the striker, firing the gun. That's all you're doing. As you can imagine, this can lead to a much lighter and crisper trigger pull. Some examples of this are, the PPQ, the VP9, the Janix. So let's look at how Glock has converted their system to a pre-cocked striker with the performance trigger. And it does feel very different. So inside the gun, you can see that things do look a bit different. This is a standard Glock. This is the one with the new performance trigger. First of all, I want to note before we dive into how this works, I feel a difference just when the gun cycles too. There's more resistance when you cock the gun, which I've never experienced before. I think it's just from, you're cocking that striker, but I don't feel that with the PPQ and the like. I don't know. Maybe it's there and I've just never noticed it, but I checked some of my other guns and I just didn't feel that there. So we saw that things are a bit different inside the gun. There's more than just the usual connector, trigger bar, and spring setup that we're also accustomed to seeing. So when the gun cycles, this striker tab foot thingy, this here, I'll include some pictures to make this easier. It has a slope, moves up on the opposite slope here. Again, I'll include a photo. This piece here functions as a sear. The spring beneath it pops it up in front of the face of the striker tab and holds it in place. The recoil spring pulls the slide forward and back into battery, but our little sear doodad thingy holds the striker to the rear, ready to be released. Then when you pull the trigger, pushing the trigger bar to the rear, it pushes the sear down, and that drops the striker, firing the gun. You can see that. Now I'll probably include a second super close-up video on that. You can see the trigger bar kind of sliding up and down. This piece, I think that explains the feel of the trigger. There's no wall. It's a rolling break, kind of like a very worn-in standard Glock trigger, only lighter. So I like that feel-wise, it does feel Glock-ish. It doesn't fully mimic the feel of something like a PPQ. And normally that would be bad, right? Because the PPQ and the P99, that's the best striker-fired trigger on the market, right? Well, yeah, I mean, it would probably be sort of objectively better if it just straight up copied that feel. But, I have those things. Many of us have multiple guns, and it's nice to just have something that's a little bit different, I guess. Because rolling brakes, some people prefer them. There's a feeling among some folks who do competition that like rolling brakes are faster. I don't know. I don't know if I notice any difference there. So, there's no crisp wall. Looking at how this works, how could there be, right? And we'll talk in detail about rolling brakes when we discuss performance. So does this system leave all the Glock safeties in place? Yes, all the ones that likely matter to you. We are removing one thing that could be called a safety feature, depending on your perspective. We know we have our trigger dingus safety, and our trigger bar has the usual little protrusion here, which activates the striker safety right there. Those are still there and working the same as always. Now, what was I talking about, when I said something that could be called a safety feature? Well, you could call the original trigger pull and its kind of longer, stiffer nature, you could call that a safety feature, and I would argue that it is. But obviously, you can't have a lighter pull and keep that in place. Now, if you're worried about a pre-cocked striker going off following a parts failure, it's not an issue, in my opinion. For one thing, there have been pre-cocked strikers in the wild for decades, going all the way back to the P99 in the 90s. But more than that, the striker safety would prevent a discharge. So even if the sear thingy here were to fail releasing the striker, the gun wouldn't go off because you didn't pull the trigger. This has to move to the rear in order to activate the striker safety plunger, which would let the striker go all the way forward. So yes, all of the physical safeties are in place, but I would argue that for some people, the original Glock trigger might offer some safety advantages. A more deliberate trigger pull is required with a longer motion. Depending on your experience, training, and some other factors, you might benefit from this extra layer of safety. And the original trigger is a bit heavier as well. Performance. The trigger has performed very well. What did you expect? It's a Glock factory product. Not that Glock gets everything right. I mean, looking at the old Glock 44 there, but they do get it right far more often than they get it wrong, in my experience. There's nothing to say about reliability. It works, and the gun runs as well as it has in the past. The end. So it's, it works. But how does it feel? That's what we really care about here. Let's put the gun back together so we can look at that. Ugh. There's some light, relatively smooth take up, and I can feel that the trigger bar is pushing on the striker safety plunger, which that part does not feel so smooth. The resistance that you're feeling is just the trigger return spring at this point. A lot of precock striker guns definitely have a smoother, more pleasant take up than this one, like the PPQ and the P99. Then you reach a point of resistance. It's not a wall though, it's just resistance. Now we're beginning to pull the sear thingy downward. So the resistance you're feeling is the spring that pushes that piece up, and then it's friction against the face of the striker tab thingy. Continue rearward. The sear drops all the way down, releasing the striker. Definitely a rolling break. There is no crisp wall past which the striker immediately drops. Again, like on the P99, I'm going to be saying that a lot. So I like a rolling break, though I don't really have a distinct preference. I just like a trigger that feels good. I have some guns with rolling breaks, some with super smooth, crisp walls. Just kind of a good trigger is a good trigger to me. That's why I've got like a bunch of different kinds of Geisleys in different rifles, because I don't know, sometimes your little finger just wants to touch something different. They just be that way. I just like a trigger that feels good. Some rolling breaks feel amazing. Some firm walls feel right. I've heard some competition shooters say that they prefer a rolling break, claiming that it helps them shoot a bit faster. Maybe it does. I don't know, but it feels good. However, you may not like it, but it does a good job of mimicking what a worn-in Glock trigger feels like, but much better. It still feels Glock-ish, for good or ill, which is in the eye of the beholder, to be sure. One more time. Very much a rolling break. Let's look at the reset. Very firm. Firmer than you would expect from a trigger this light. One more time. The reset is also fairly short. Certainly not as short as some. To me, it feels noticeably shorter than the standard Glock reset, but that could be caused by the geometry of the trigger shoe. You know what? Let's compare it to a PPQ real fast. Okay, my beloved PPQ. Yeah, the PPQ has a much smoother take up and a very firm, crisp break. Pull weight feels about the same. PPQ might be slightly heavier. PPQ is probably more like 4.5 pounds or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, PPQ feels a lot better. It is objectively a better trigger there, I think. So, though the quality of the performance trigger is excellent, I think a lot of people are going to feel that it isn't as good as the other pre-cocked trigger systems. So what Glock tried to do was maintain the sort of Glock feel, but compared to its competitors, yeah, I think a lot of you are going to think, God, I wish they had just made it feel more like the Walther. So is it faster? Is it a performance trigger compared to the stock trigger? Maybe. It's definitely lighter, and that rolling break feels fantastic when you go fast. Personally, I've been shooting the standard Glock trigger for 2 decades, and my performance was roughly the same with both. I didn't see any real difference other than that the performance trigger feels nice and is maybe more satisfying to use. I've been shooting pre-cocked striker guns for about a decade, and I don't notice much difference in terms of performance between this and the pre-cocked strikers either. But some people are more sensitive to triggers, very sensitive in some cases, and there's nothing wrong with that if that's you. Doing this channel, I shoot such a wide range of guns. I'm not much bothered unless the trigger is just fucking atrocious. Modern striker-fired handguns are so good these days They're all so damn similar to one another. I only notice minor differences between them, and generally they all have workable triggers. That's why whenever I review some sort of black plastic modern handgun, I really dive into the weeds, because that's where the differences are. The broad strokes are all the same these days. All that to say, if you're sensitive to triggers, this might make all the difference for you. If you've got a Glock and you feel like the trigger's just in your way, the stock trigger, this might be something that you should look at. I definitely like this more than a lot of the aftermarket Glock triggers. That's for damn sure. And it's going to make even more of a difference potentially if you're into competition style shooting. Speaking of, because of how light this trigger is, coupled with the rolling brake, that's really what this is for. For my taste, I think it's a bit too light for a defensive gun. This is really going to shine in a competition or target scenario. For a defensive gun, I much prefer the standard Glock trigger. Not only is it heavier, but you get more feedback from the trigger. There's more standing in the way of you firing the gun, but not so much that it affects my performance. I like that in a defensive trigger. But of course, I would, my preference is for hammer-fired double action, single action guns. Although, I still love my PPQ to death. It's still absolutely fantastic, but the PPQ also, there's more resistance than you're feeling with this one. The PPQ's trigger at 4.5, 5 pounds, some of them, because of manufacturing tolerances, go as high as 5.5 pounds. That's much more like a sort of normal defensive trigger weight. To me, the stock Glock trigger, especially with a minus connector, it's plenty light with a great reset. I don't see why folks spend so much time complaining about it. If you don't like it, there are piles of other striker-fired guns that are going to be more to your liking. Just buy something else. Let the Glock be the Glock. I certainly own other things. I don't feel like shooting a Glock every day, so when I don't, I just grab something else. So I think that aftermarket triggers for the Glock are often unnecessary. If I want a different trigger, I shoot a different gun. It's like this with guitars. I've worked as a luthier for the past decade in addition to doing studio work, and I've worked on and built a ton of guitars. One time a guy brought me this beautiful vintage Strat, and in the 80s, he'd had the poor thing routed for a Floyd Rose and humbuckers. I opened the case, and this poor monstrosity is staring up at me, whispering, "Kill me." It was really sad. He'd come to his senses all these years later and realized that actually he just needed a different guitar that was built to play that kind of awful hair metal bullshit. He'd tried to fit a humbucker-shaped peg in a Strat-shaped hole, and it was very sad. So I repaired the routes, had some replica Strat pickups made that matched the year, and as best as could be done, returned it to what it was when it left the Fender factory most of a lifetime ago. It looked much happier. It just needed to be a Strat. So it is with guns. Just let them be what they are. If you need a different thing, just get the different thing. When we try too hard to twist tools away from their original purpose, often, but not always, we make them worse. They don't do the new thing as well as something else, and now they don't do the old thing either. They're just mediocre at all of it after that. So there are so many other models that do the pre-cocked striker thing better than this trigger, I think. The Walther P99, for instance, has not only the best pre-cocked striker trigger I've ever felt, but the best striker trigger in general that I've ever fired. The PPQ, of course, feels fantastic. The VP9, the Janix, those guns just do this a bit better. So let the Glock be a Glock. They do what they do very well, balancing trigger pull safety with great shooting performance. And it's not like people haven't been shooting the original Glock triggers in competition for years. Yeah, a lot of those people, they do drop in aftermarket triggers, but many don't. And I've seen countless shooters perform incredibly well with out-of-the-box Glocks, straight up how they left the factory. Now, I'm not discouraging you from changing the trigger in your Glock. You do what you want, you do what makes you happy, do as thou wilt. But I wanted to offer a perspective that you maybe don't hear very often. Last of all, I also have to note that I'm just not crazy about this new flat, wide trigger shoe. I know this shape is all the rage in the aftermarket trigger world, but it doesn't feel as good to me as the standard trigger shoe. I wish they'd just use the old shape and change the internal mechanism. Or at the very least, just let me pick between the two. That's purely subjective though, and you might feel the new shoe and be like, wow, that's the best thing I've ever felt. That was a very loud motorcycle, I apologize. Final thoughts. The Glock Performance Trigger is pretty good, but depending on your preferences and tastes, you might not be particularly impressed. You might see it as an expensive, somewhat refined version of a trigger system you already dislike, rather than the reinvention you hope for. However, if you like the standard Glock trigger but want something smoother for competition, or you got a couple guns and you want one of them to be different, you're probably going to enjoy this new trigger, though you may end up just going back to the original trigger with a minus connector. All in all, I much prefer the Performance Trigger to the aftermarket Glock triggers I've tried in the past. A lot of those are certainly lighter, but they often feel oddly spongy and sometimes feel so good because they don't engage with the striker safety plunger. If you want to keep all the factory safeties in place while improving the trigger pull, this is one you should look at. At the very least, just give it a try. See what you think. Thanks for watching. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and I'll talk to you soon. Good night.